The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass as Jake stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand. He exhaled, ready to sink into the comfort of his favorite lawn chairs, the perfect place to start his Saturday, except they were gone. His brow furrowed. He scanned the porch, the yard, even the driveway as if the chairs might have wandered off on their own. His pulse quickened. Did someone steal them? His neighborhood wasn't exactly known for crime, but then again, anything could happen. Movement across the street caught his eye. A familiar figure stood with her arms crossed, lips pressed into a smug line. Karen. HOA president. Dictator in pastel cardigans. Jake's stomach sank. He already knew, but he still walked across the street, jaw tight. Karen, he called, keeping his voice even. You wouldn't happen to know what happened to my chairs, would you? She didn't even pretend to be surprised. In fact, she looked pleased. Oh, those? She tilted her head. They were in violation of HOA regulations. I had them removed. Jake's grip tightened around his coffee mug. Removed? They were on my property. Karen let out a breathy, theatrical sigh, as if she were exhausted by his inability to understand basic rules. The HOA has very clear guidelines about outdoor furniture. Only pre-approved patio sets are allowed. Yours? They were not. He blinked, barely able to process the sheer absurdity. Since when? Karen gave a practiced, condescending smile. Since always. Jake had lived in the neighborhood for 3 years. Never once had anyone mention this. He had seen neighbors with mismatched chairs, hammocks, even an inflatable pool. That's not in the rule book, he said firmly. Her smile widened like a cat playing with its food. HOA rules are subject to interpretation. And I interpret them. He could feel the heat rising in his face. Where are they? Karen's expression didn't flicker. Disposed of. His jaw clenched. You threw out my property? You should be thanking me, she said breezily. I saved you from an HOA fine. That would have been a real shame. A sick, twisting frustration coiled in his chest. This wasn't about rules. This was about power. Karen had always been the kind of person who thrived on control. She didn't just enforce HOA policies, she weaponized them. Jake took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Then I'll take this up with the board. Karen shrugged. Be my guest. The way she said it made his stomach drop. By the time Jake got in touch with the HOA board, the situation became even more infuriating. Every person he spoke to either dodged the conversation or nervously parroted Karen's words. She said it was a violation, they repeated. So, it was a violation. He pointed out that there was no specific rule against lawn chairs. They fumbled through responses. Well, it could be considered clutter, or we do want to maintain a certain aesthetic. It was clear, no one wanted to cross Karen. The city was no help either. HOA rules were considered private agreements between homeowners and the association. As long as they didn't violate city code, the law wouldn't intervene. Days passed, and every time he saw Karen, she looked amused. She would glance at his porch, now bare, and smirk. She enjoyed this. Jake felt the helpless frustration gnawing at him, but he also knew one thing for sure. Karen wanted him to accept defeat. That wasn't going to happen. Jake sat on his bare porch, the absence of his chairs gnawing at him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just about the furniture anymore. It was about control, about Karen flexing her petty authority simply because she could. Every time he saw her walking by, scanning the neighborhood like a hawk, that smug satisfaction radiating from her expression, his frustration burned hotter. He needed to do something. At first, he considered fighting the HOA through official channels. Maybe he could gather signatures, appeal to the board, or even consult a lawyer. But the truth was, Karen had the system rigged in her favor. The board was spineless, and legal action would take months, if not years. By then, Karen would have found another way to make his life miserable. No, this wasn't a battle he could win with logic. He needed to play her game, but better. The idea came to him late at night while scrolling through his phone, still stewing over the injustice of it all. His thumb hovered over an article about creative revenge, and suddenly an image formed in his mind, a yard full of something much worse than lawn chairs. Something that would make Karen regret ever messing with him. He grabbed his keys and called his buddy Rick. Rick was the kind of guy who lived for chaos. The moment Jake explained the plan, he was already laughing. Oh man, I know just the place. They drove out to the junkyard on the edge of town, headlights cutting through the darkness. The place was a graveyard of discarded furniture. Old couches, broken recliners, and sun-bleached love seats stacked in haphazard piles. The air smelled of rust and damp upholstery. "This," Rick declared, clapping Jake on the back, "is a gold mine." Jake surveyed the scene, heart pounding with a mix of nerves and exhilaration. They needed something hideous, something undeniably worse than his lawn chairs. If Karen wanted to enforce her ridiculous interpretation of HOA rules, he was going to give her a reason to regret it. After some searching, they hit the jackpot: a massive floral print couch with sagging cushions and a torn armrest. It looked like it had been plucked straight from the 1980s and left to rot. Beside it, they found a mustard yellow love seat with stuffing peeking out and a faded sectional that reeked of mildew. "Perfect," Jake said, grinning. With considerable effort, and several close calls involving a rusted nail and an unexpected rat, they managed to load the monstrosities into Rick's truck. The ride home was spent in near hysterical laughter, the absurdity of their mission making the tension from the past few days melt away. By the time they reached Jake's house, the neighborhood was silent, the streetlights casting long shadows. They worked quickly, dragging the couches into position right where his lawn chairs had once been. The final setup was a masterpiece. The floral couch took center stage, flanked by the mustard love seat and the sectional, forming an impromptu outdoor living room. To complete the look, Jake scrounged up an old coffee table from his garage and placed it in the center, adding a cracked lamp for effect. Rick stepped back, admiring their work. "This is art." Jake couldn't stop grinning. "Let's see Karen try to interpret this." As he headed inside, he couldn't shake the anticipation buzzing under his skin. He knew without a doubt that morning was going to be glorious. The scream shattered the morning quiet. Jake barely had time to pour his coffee before the unmistakable sound of Karen's outrage tore through the neighborhood. He stepped onto his porch, savoring the moment before looking toward the street. There she was, standing frozen on the sidewalk, hands clenched into fists, face a violent shade of red. Her gaze was locked on the hideous junkyard furniture sprawled across his lawn. For a long, glorious second, she was speechless. Then, like a dam breaking, the words poured out. "What's this?" Jake took a slow sip of his coffee, fighting the smirk threatening to break across his face. "Morning, Karen." She whirled on him, eyes blazing. "This is a violation. A disgrace. You have trash on your lawn." He feigned confusion. "Trash? No, these are perfectly good couches." He gestured at the floral monstrosity. "Comfy too." Her hands trembled with barely contained fury. "You think this is funny?" "A little." Her nostrils flared. "You will remove these immediately." Jake leaned against the porch railing, utterly at ease. "I don't see why. You made it very clear that lawn chairs weren't allowed." "These aren't chairs." "You never said anything about couches." A strangled noise escaped her throat. She took a breath, trying to compose herself, but her voice still wobbled. "This is an eyesore. You are lowering property values." Jake shrugged. "That's subjective." A few neighbors had started to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some whispered to each other, barely hiding their amusement. A few even had their phones out. Karen noticed. Her back stiffened, her voice rising. "You're in violation of HOA policy, and I will be fining you." Jake tilted his head. "Which policy exactly?" She blinked. He continued. "I've reviewed the guidelines. There's nothing about couches on lawns. If there was, I'm sure a competent HOA president would have cited it by now." A ripple of stifled laughter moved through the small crowd. Karen's face darkened. "You're being petty," she hissed. "You started it." For a moment she just stared at him, her breath coming fast. Then, in a last-ditch grasp for control, she spun around. "I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting. This mess will be gone today." She stormed off, phone already pressed to her ear. Jake took another sip of coffee, watching her retreat. This was far from over. By noon, the HOA board had assembled in Karen's driveway, their folding chairs arranged in a stiff semicircle like a tribunal preparing for sentencing. Karen stood in front, pacing, a clipboard clutched in her white-knuckled grip. Behind her, a growing number of neighbors gathered, drawn in by the spectacle. Some whispered, others openly smirked. Jake sat calmly on his porch, watching the show unfold. Karen cleared her throat, forcing silence. "We are here to address a blatant violation of HOA policy," she announced, her voice thick with manufactured authority. "This," she gestured wildly at Jake's lawn, "is an eyesore, an embarrassment, and a threat to our neighborhood standards." Jake stood and stretched. "Threat?" he repeated. "That's a little dramatic." Karen ignored him. "As HOA president, I am issuing an immediate removal order." If Mr. Carter does not comply, he will face maximum fines and possible legal action. Jake crossed his arms. On what grounds? Karen's eyes flashed. Excessive clutter. Public nuisance. Devaluation of property, *, pick 1 star. Jake shook his head. None of those are in the bylaws. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's grip on her clipboard tightened. The board has discretion in enforcing aesthetic standards. Jake smirked. Discretion? You didn't have discretion when you took my chairs. That was cut and dry, right? Black and white? But now that I found a loophole, suddenly it's about interpretation. A few chuckles broke out. Karen's face twisted in frustration. She turned sharply to the board. We must uphold the rules. It's what keeps this neighborhood respectable. One of the board members, a gray-haired man who had been quiet until now, cleared his throat. Karen, do we actually have any written policy about outdoor couches? Karen turned on him. That's not the point, Robert. Robert sighed. Actually, it is the point. Karen's face twitched. She looked around, realizing the crowd was no longer nodding along. Some board members avoided her gaze. A few neighbors openly whispered to each other. For the first time Jake saw it, the flicker of panic behind her eyes. She turned back to him. Fine. If the HOA rules aren't explicit enough for you, I'll go above them. She pulled out her phone and dialed, her voice carrying over the hushed crowd. Yes, hello? I need to report a case of illegal dumping and property neglect. She glanced at Jake, eyes gleaming. Yes. My neighbor has turned his lawn into a landfill. You might want to send an inspector immediately. A few gasps echoed through the crowd. Even for Karen this was extreme. Jake let out a low whistle. Wow. That's desperate. Karen didn't care. She ended the call with a satisfied snap of her phone case. City code enforcement will be here soon, she declared, triumphant. And they will handle this. Jake just smiled. Let's see what they think. Minutes passed. Karen stood tall, arms crossed, her victory close enough to taste. Jake sat back on his porch, relaxed. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Then a city vehicle pulled up. A man in a county uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand. He took one look at the scene, raised an eyebrow, and walked toward Jake. Sir, we got a report about an illegal dumping situation? Jake grinned. No dumping here. Just a few couches. Outdoor seating. The inspector glanced at the furniture, nodding slowly. Ah, and you own this property? Sure do. The inspector flipped through his paperwork, scanning city ordinances. Karen stepped forward, breathless with excitement. This is a public nuisance, she said quickly. An absolute disgrace to the neighborhood. It violates several codes, I'm sure of it. The inspector frowned, still reading. Actually, it doesn't. The silence that followed was beautiful. Karen's smile faltered. What? The inspector tapped the paper. City code doesn't regulate furniture on private lawns unless it obstructs sidewalks or poses a health hazard. He gave the couches another glance. These are ugly as hell, but they're not breaking any laws. Jake let out an exaggerated sigh. Well, that's a relief. Karen's mouth opened and closed, her composure cracking. You can't be serious. You have to do something. The inspector shrugged. Not my jurisdiction, ma'am. He turned to Jake. Have a nice day. As he walked back to his truck, the crowd burst into hushed laughter. Someone clapped. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God, she lost." Karen spun to the board. Well, we're still the HO. We can still fine him. Robert rubbed his temples. Karen, let it go. Let it go. Her voice was shrill now, desperation creeping in. He's mocking us. If we don't act, anyone could do this. Our neighborhood will turn into a junkyard. A voice called from the crowd. Honestly, I kinda like it. Feels cozy. Laughter followed. Karen's face contorted. You people don't understand. I keep this neighborhood in order. Without me. Without you, Robert interrupted, his voice firm, things might actually be better. Karen stiffened. Excuse me? Robert looked to the crowd. I've been on the board for 8 years. I've seen a lot of complaints about Karen. About her enforcement tactics. He nodded toward Jake. This is just the latest in a long list of power trips. A murmur of agreement spread. Karen took a shaky step back. Robert sighed. I think it's time for a change. Karen's breath hitched. You can't. Oh, we can. A neighbor held up a clipboard. We've been collecting signatures for a petition to remove you as HOA president. We needed 20% of the neighborhood. We got 35. Karen swayed on her feet. Rick grinned. That's democracy, baby. For the first time in her reign of terror, Karen had no words. Jake stepped forward, savoring the moment. Guess you should have let me keep my lawn chairs. The vote was held the next morning. By noon, Karen was officially out. Jake celebrated with a lawn lounge party. Neighbors gathered, drinks in hand, sinking into the awful junkyard couches. Music played. Someone grilled burgers. And Karen? She stayed inside, blinds drawn, her kingdom reduced to nothing. As Jake leaned back on the floral monstrosity, he smiled. Petty justice had never felt so good.